If you want a vision of the future, Winston, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever.
You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth.
Someone is trying to teach me a lesson in futility. Why am I the only one who isn't killed?
They will run you dizzy. They will pile falsehood on top of falsehood until you can't tell a lie from the truth, and you won't even want to. That's how the powerful keep their power. Don't you read the papers?
I just want to say one word to you. Just one word.
Yes, sir.
Are you listening?
Yes, I am.
Plastics.
I'm going to get your money for you. But if you don't get the President of the United States on that phone, you know what's going to happen to you?
What?
You're going to have to answer to the Coca-Cola Company.
The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business, Mr. Beale. It has been since man crawled out of the slime.
Welcome to another episode of Our Interesting Times. It is my pleasure to have Thomas Henry Horan back on the show. He returns to discuss his book, The Myth of the Zodiac Killer. Thomas has also written The Great Zodiac Killer Hoax of 1969, The Great Zodiac Killer Hoax of 1986. He's covered this case well. Now, you also have a new podcast out now, correct?
Yes, I do, Tim. Thank you so much for having me back, and thank you so much for asking to do an episode about that third book, The Myth of the Zodiac Killer. Yes, we just started. I'm a member of a network. I'm an English professor, but I had previous experience as an investigator and private investigator from years ago, and I'm hooked up with other investigators and, of course, podcasters and hackers and informed sources and people like that. And they kept saying, let's get a podcast going. And I said, well, we need to find a host. I'll be glad to be executive producer or at least a co-host. And finally, we couldn't wait any longer. So we've got a couple of episodes up. It's called the Stones Unturned Podcast. And we look at those overlooked leads or forgotten details or things of cases that people think are solved or never been solved. Conspiracy theories and things like that. And so I'm basically the host, and that seems to be going okay. My only other show business experience had been as a comedian, and I didn't know, when I'm teaching, in my head, I'm Professor Kingsfield from the Paper Chase. Now I know it doesn't come out that way. So when I'm trying to do this podcast, if I'm interviewing someone, that's going pretty well. I had interviewed people for print journalism before, but never for like broadcast. And I'd been interviewed, and I was pretty good at that. So when I'm doing an episode all by myself, in my head, I'm that guy from PBS Frontline, with the best narrator voice ever.
Yeah, yes.
But until I listen to the playback and I just come, so I hope people like it. We've already got we haven't even promoted it yet. We've got so many episodes in simultaneous production. I've got 2 episodes up, and we've already got a couple of hundred followers and listeners. So I'm very grateful for that. So it's called the Stones Unturned Podcast. We're hosted on Podbean, and for people who are interested, that's our favorite app for listening to podcasts. We're also, of course, on iTunes and Google Play. So thanks for letting me plug that.
Okay, great. And people can they listen to it and they get like a sample, then they can subscribe to it to get the whole thing, or?
Well, what we do now is we're not trying to make a lot of money, but we do. There is a crowdfunding option on Podbean. It's not even Patreon. We do have a couple paid subscribers, which is great. Our operating costs are a couple $100 a month, but it's mainly this massive network of people who are doing all this great research. And I've been fortunate enough to come on like your show and some other shows, but now we have our own podcast. The first 2 episodes, I did an episode introducing the Zodiac Killer Hoax and starting with debunking Robert Graysmith and his book. And now the second episode is the first installment. We're looking at this Keddy Cabin 28 triple homicide from 1981. And there's been this effort to frame these 2 dead guys for this murder of these 3 people and disappearance of this little girl. And we kind of tear that apart. Some of our volunteer researchers, Kim and Kathy and I, we talk about this. We go through. We've been able to obtain most of the case files. We go through it, the actual investigation day by day, and so we're taking our time with it. So those are the first 2 episodes that are up now. We have lots more coming. I don't know how fast. Like I said, I agreed to be executive producer, but now I'm also the host. So that's as you know, it took an hour to listen to. It must have taken an hour to write. No, it doesn't work that way.
No, it doesn't. No.
But we've been very fortunate so far to get some listeners, and thanks for plugging us. What else can I tell you about that? That's it about now.
That's
now.
The Stones Unturned Podcast.
The Stones Unturned Podcast. And
okay, so if you just Google that, they'll get that.
Right.
Okay.
You can find us on iTunes, or it's hosted on Podbean, but you can find us. Oh, and of course it automatically goes to YouTube.
Okay.
Yeah. So
it's on YouTube as well. Okay, that's it. Yeah, it's a good platform to use while we still have it.
And we'll be talking. We have a lot of ongoing cases. A lot of us are involved in, this whole Pizzagate, Pedogate thing, and go all the way back, tracing these people all the way back. Believe it or not, it goes all the way back to the Boxer Rebellion in the 1850s, and right up to today. Like some people who have been dying mysteriously ever since Tony Podesta got kicked out of his own lobbying firm, that kind of thing. And the of course, I'm an expert on the Zodiac Killer hoax and things like that. We have we do look at cold cases. We do look at, is there a connection between, an upcoming episode that I think people will enjoy is the connection between King Kong and Air America, which turns out to be a fascinating story.
You touched on that in our past discussion, briefly about how all these things kind of tie in together, and Hollywood and drug trafficking and human trafficking and geopolitics and
right, exactly.
So, well, the Zodiac Killer. I'm gonna just borrow from from Wikipedia. They have a pretty decent synopsis of the standard narrative. It's the Zodiac Killer, or Zodiac, was a serial killer who operated in Northern California from at least the late 1960s to the early 1970s. The killer's identity remains unknown. The Zodiac murdered victims in Benicia, Vallejo, Lake Berryessa, and San Francisco between December 1968 and October 1969. 4 men and 3 women between the ages of 16 and 29 were targeted. The killer originated the name Zodiac in a series of taunting letters sent to the local Bay Area press. These letters included 4 cryptograms or ciphers. Of the 4 cryptograms sent, only 1 has been definitively solved. Suspects have been named by law enforcement and amateur investigators, but no conclusive evidence has surfaced. The San Francisco Police Department marked the case inactive in April 2004, but it remained, but it reopened it at some point prior to March 2007. The case also remains open in the city of Vallejo, as well as in Napa County and Solano County, and the California Department of Justice has maintained an open case file on the Zodiac murders since 1969. Now, you said, according to the actual police department in your research, the department files from the original murder cases, there never was a Zodiac killer, only some phony letters to the San Francisco Chronicle claiming credit, and some otherwise unrelated murders. And you call this a blatant hoax perpetrated by Robert Graysmith, who sold a book, a.k.a. Robert Smith. You actually worked for the San Francisco, the Chronicle, right?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. That's
yes.
That's a pretty good synopsis of the standard narrative. Let's let you quickly deconstruct it. We went into it last time in the last interview, but I think just for the benefit of our listeners, kind of restate the case and why you think it was a hoax, and go into this analysis you provide in the book about a literary critique of the hoax.
Well, let's tell the story of the story. That's called meta-narrative.
Okay.
There, I squeezed in what you squeezed in epistemological. I'm going to squeeze in meta-narrative. The story of this story. 1986, Robert Smith Jr., who changed his name to Robert Graysmith. Now, that's a red flag right there for someone who calls himself an investigative journalist. He came out with a book through St. Martin's Press called Zodiac, and it's about this supposed serial killer who killed a bunch of young people, and then he wrote these tantalizing confession letters and cryptograms that were published on the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle in the late 60s and early 70s. And Graysmith had worked there at that time and said that this case intrigued him. That's how he became an investigative journalist. And he tells this story that he's the only person who talked to all the police departments and was the only person coordinating information between police departments. And then he supposedly comes across this suspect who is very, very likely the Zodiac Killer. Now, what he didn't tell people was he was supposed to come out with a book in 1981 through W.W. Norton. And in that book, he had a completely different suspect. In his book, he calls this guy Donald Andrews. Of course, he used a lot of pseudonyms. And what he doesn't tell people is some fact checkers at W.W. Norton contacted the FBI, and this, that, and the other happened, and they quietly canceled his project. And he had to come up with a new suspect. And finally, by 1986, you have St. Martin's Press coming out with this book, Zodiac. Now, his whole book turns out to have been it's 95% lies. He really did get access. He buddied up to a guy named Mel Nikolai, who was he was an investigator, and he coordinated investigations at the California Department of Justice. And Nikolai had been to this seminar in 1968 put on by the FBI, educating law enforcement about this new phenomenon they become aware of that we now call a serial killer, to look for murders that don't look related, but they're unsolved, and maybe they have something in common. Maybe they have a common MO or something. So Graysmith had buddied up to this guy, and they had received copies of files from San Francisco Police Department, Vallejo, Solano County, Napa County, of these cases that this guy writing letters to the Chronicle had been taking credit for. And that's how Graysmith not only got to see the files, but it turns out he fed Nikolai some false information, and Nikolai's copies of Nikolai's reports that he sends out in the early 1970s to law enforcement agencies has lies planted in it, and the source apparently is Graysmith. Now, the reason why Nikolai got involved in this is because in December 1968, between Napa between Vallejo and Benicia, this rural area in Solano County, these two teenagers had been shot. They were sitting in a car parked in a public utility parking lot alongside the highway, and they'd been shot and killed in and around the car. And there had been a rash of methamphetamine-related homicides. There was a gang affiliated with some guys in the Hells Angels, and they were shooting a bunch of people that they suspected were were snitching on them. They'd found a lot of bodies dumped in that parking lot. So that's the first thing they think. This is another meth-related killing. But then it turns out that these two kids, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, they didn't do drugs. And so they're kind of stumped for a few days. And then it turns out that maybe David had gotten into some beef with these drug dealers and had threatened to turn them in, and then all of a sudden their investigation just stops. It just stops on that Sunday. They don't do any more investigating. And the lead investigator just throws up his hands and says, well, it must have been some lone lunatic. Now, Benicia Police Department, they have always claimed they know who did it. It was these guys, one guy in the Hells Angels and some of his buddies, and they had suspected, they think they suspected David and Betty Lou of being in that parking lot to spy on some drug deals going on. That doesn't mean that they can prove 100% that the guy is guilty. But however, in the meantime, in July of 1969, two other young people, they're not married to each other, Darlene Ferrin and Mike Mageau, they're shot. Darlene dies. Mike survives. Now, this is in the parking lot of Blue Rock Springs Park, where, again, lots and lots of drug deals are going down. Now, apparently, two things happened. Some reporter probably my mind Peterson, very famous reporter, he had jumped to a conclusion maybe the two shootings were connected, and that's how he played it up in the newspaper that very next day. And Mel Nikolai also, he's got his eyes open for possibly related cases. Now, it turns out the evidence tends to point in the opposite direction. No connection between these two shootings. But once Nikolai alerted all the Bay Area police departments, we may have one of these serial killer type things going on. Between him, Dave Peterson, and the Chronicle, they start really promoting this story. And that's the phenomenon I was originally looking at. I had experience previously as an investigator and in reviewing investigations for insurance companies and things, but that as an English professor, I was interested in this whole fake news, sensational media, and these letters that were coming into the Chronicle before we had websites with comment sections. People would read stories in newspapers and magazines, and they would write letters to the editor, and those letters are addressed, Dear Editor. So it's kind of this proto-comment section dialogue going on between this newspaper and this person claiming to have committed these murders. Now, this is after the newspapers have already played up this angle, that there is a possible connection between these murders. And so a few weeks after Darlene and Mike are shot, these letters start showing up at the Chronicle. And as I looked into this, I realized the first thing I realized was how much the Chronicle had wildly exaggerated certain details about the case. And this became connected to this phenomenon of the Boston Strangler, and that's what, they were desperate for a story like the Boston Strangler, and I just dug into this and got into the history of vigilante journalism and fake news nationwide, but especially in the Bay Area. And as I researched that, I came across some researchers had obtained those exact same files that Graysmith had originally used to write his book. So out of curiosity, I'm checking through all this, and I'm like, wait a minute. This is not what Graysmith put in his book. He'll quote a paragraph from one of these reports, but he'll change a date, or he'll change the identity of the suspect, or he'll change the identity of the witness or something. And I was like, wow, that's weird. But so those are the two books, The Great Zodiac Killer Hoax of 1986, that goes through Graysmith's book page by page and debunks that. And then it became obvious as I debunked Graysmith's book that some of the lies he told had been about the authenticity of those letters. The part of the myth is that the police were able to verify all the information in those letters, that they must have come from the killer. Well, that's not true. Actually, the information in the letters proves that they couldn't have been written by the killer. And Graysmith obviously saw what I saw because he lied about those details in his book. So that's when I realized well, gee, those letters are some kind of hoax. And that just went off into a whole other book, The Great Zodiac Killer Hoax of 1969. So, but tonight, and I'm very grateful for this, no one else wants to hear about this whole myth of the Zodiac Killer, how this is a big pop culture phenomenon that grew and built and led right straight to this hoax that the Chronicle obviously played along with to sell newspapers.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. You mentioned, the Boston Strangler case, and of course the Zodiac case offered him sort of this is a West Coast version of it.
Well, and it's almost a ripoff. The story, this myth of the Zodiac, there's a myth of the Boston Strangler. Mm-hmm. There were probably three, and two of them obviously copycatting the first one. And it turns out Albert DeSalvo, who was a compulsive rapist, started copycatting this strangler, and a lot of the details of the story are exactly the same. This myth grows up in the Boston media that these different police departments are not cooperating. Now that's not true, and it's when you read the book The Boston Strangler by Gerald Frank, that's like the gold standard in true crime. But they made this into a movie. Mm-hmm. With Henry Fonda and Tony Curtis, which not only totally fictionalizes what's in the book, but totally fictionalizes the case. So you have all the elements there. You have a serial killer who the police are powerless to catch because they're not cooperating with each other, and only these heroes in the news media are telling the people the truth, and they start to change and one of the strange things is it becomes obvious that the MOs of these different killers are different, but the way the media reports it, and there's an actual scene in the movie where a TV reporter says this on the broadcast, this lack of consistency is the consistency. This lack of a pattern is the pattern, right? It's fake news. Yeah. It's fake news that we hear about today. Fake news. People forget. Before there was a National Enquirer, the tabloid newspapers were in individual cities, and on the West Coast, the tabloid paper was the San Francisco Chronicle. It was very sensational. They ran a lot of fake stories. And as I dug into this, the Chronicle and Examiner go all the way back to like the Gold Rush days.
Is this part of the Hearst Empire?
Became, yes. Okay. And the Examiner for a while. And so you had these papers competing with each other on this vigilante journalism market, where these newspaper editors are on the city council and they're exposing each other for corruption, they're exposing crime, they're whipping lynch mobs into frenzies, and this goes on, and they compete with each other over this forever. And in those days, reporters would compete with the cops to see who could solve a crime first. But there was this weird symbiosis. Police officers didn't like to type reports. So what they would do is they'd have a reporter, and they'd let the reporter type the report from the cop's handwritten notes, or sometimes the reporter sitting in the police station taking witness statements because they had the skills. And then that's how the reporter gets the material for the story, right? But at the same time, they're competing. And a good example of that was the so-called Black Dahlia Avenger case, where reporters are the police are so swamped with tips. They need all the help they can get. Reporters are answering phones. They're taking witness statements. They run out of the police station. They don't even give the cops a copy of this statement. They try to find this witness and try to find this evidence. I had talked to an old school freelance photographer who took a lot of crime scene photos. He'd sell some of them to the police. He'd sell a couple of them to the newspapers. This guy had a curio cabinet in his house with souvenirs he had pocketed from over 100 homicide scenes that he'd photographed. And he had one whole shelf dedicated to these little glass menagerie animals that he'd taken from, lots of victims had these in their homes, and he would take one. So this is, nowadays there's this wall between the police and journalists that didn't exist back in those days. And then you have, by the 1960s, you have the Chronicle and Examiner merge in 1965, owned by one media company. And what they do is they move both newspapers into one building. So they have the sensational Chronicle come out in the morning, and then the more somewhat more respectable Examiner come out in the afternoon. But even though they're owned by the same company, these two papers, the staff, they're still expected to compete. And by this time, the national advertising agencies, they're only putting national ads in one newspaper per market. And so it's a fight to the death among these newspapers. And they just get more and more, well, they'd never really stopped being sensational. A famous example, if you've ever seen the great Marlon Brando movie, The Wild Bunch, or The Wild Ones, which about the motorcycle gang, that's based on supposedly this Hells Angels motorcycle riot that took place in Hollister, California. That was all fake. That was all staged by the Chronicle. And in fact, there's a picture of this guy supposed to be a biker. His bike is parked on this like pile of beer bottles and things where they've trashed this town. He was actually the photographer assigned to the story, and then he had somebody else take his picture sitting on this motorcycle. The whole thing, the whole Hollister riot was a fake. Yeah, it was fake. Yeah, there's fake news.
Yeah, there's the press to create this story. Then there's Hollywood to create the imagery in the minds of millions of Americans to go see these movies, and all of a sudden, the biker issue or juvenile delinquency becomes a national crisis, right?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. That never. I mean, sure, there had been some biker trouble, and sure, there was a juvenile delinquency problem, but this whole phenomenon gets blown out of proportion. Now, at the Chronicle in particular, they had several of their top journalists, their star journalists, Herb Caen, Stanton Delaplane. These guys they're writing like Herb Caen, and he's brilliant, and he's covering, like, he covers high society, low society. He's just the great eyes and ears of San Francisco, of the whole population of San Francisco, and he writes these great columns. And he's up for a Pulitzer Prize because he writes these columns that are based on these letters he gets from readers. And he ends up at the last minute, he's disqualified from winning a Pulitzer because he doesn't actually have the letters. So he starts writing phony letters to himself at the Chronicle, and the next year he gets his Pulitzer. And Stanton Delaplane, who is sending in these postcards he's going on these trips, like he goes to Paris for this European Economic Commission that they're going on all these trips. He sends these postcards. He was sitting at a bar in Washington Square Park in San Francisco writing these phony postcards. And there's even a very serious scandal. Paul Avery, who's played, of course, by the great Robert Downey Jr. in the Zodiac movie. Paul Avery, this real muckraking celebrity fake news journalist, he actually exposed a reporter at the Examiner who was filing these stories. He was supposedly went with Nixon on Nixon's big historic trip to communist China, and Avery pointed out, because Avery had been a journalist in the Far East, he exposed him. These are fake news stories, and these are very serious stories. So you have all this going on at the Chronicle and Examiner all the way through the 60s already. They're already writing phony letters to themselves and winning Pulitzer Prizes for doing it. They're already running all kinds of fake news stories, everything from police corruption to crime. And sometimes they are cracking murders. Ed Montgomery in 1962 had cracked a unsolved murder of this teenage girl, and he actually had found a guy with tracking dogs and actually found the girl's body buried in this guy's yard, and the guy gets convicted. And then Paul Avery tried to do the same thing in a case of a girl who had been murdered, but he failed to solve the case. So you already have this going on. Routine. I mean, it's a frantic routine. They're frantically competing for readers. They're frantically competing for these distribution numbers. Now, across the bay, the biggest newspaper besides the Chronicle is the Vallejo Times-Herald. Now, they're owned by a company that also publishes a much smaller distribution newspaper called the Vallejo News-Chronicle. And Dave Peterson is their top-notch investigative reporter. I mean, Peterson had connections in the FBI office, you name it. And a lot of his stories about this cipher slayer, this code killer, they're actually, these are police reports that he's apparently typed, because the entire report minus one or two sentences shows up. And he was apparently sort of the editor of the News Chronicle, and then he contributed stories to the Times Herald, which was not only the biggest newspaper in Solano County, it also happened to be the biggest newspaper in Napa County, and this becomes important later. So you have this atmosphere, this pressure cooker atmosphere of investigative reporting / fake news, all this stuff going on. And you have this massive phenomenon of this Boston Strangler movie, which is in the theaters at that time.
Yeah, it's December 68. It's still in the theaters when that the first shooting occurs. Yeah,
right. And so you have editors, not Abe Fortas, I'll think of his name in a minute. He's a city desk editor at the Chronicle for a long time, really made them the number one sensational newspaper. Oh boy, too bad we don't have a case like that. Why can't you guys come up with a case like that? And they do come up with a case like that. And they go way, they beat the Boston Strangler at his own game. They got a guy writing letters saying, I did it, and supposedly giving them details to prove that he did it. Now, where should we go? So eventually, now the irony is Paul Avery is writing stories where he's questioning the credibility of these letters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that very first coded message, that first cryptogram, fairly easy to crack. But you're talking about a generation of people. These people in 1969, they'd grown up with their little Orphan Annie decoder rings. I mean, this is a publicity stunt that, that get the reader involved in the story. And I write a lot about that in this book, The Myth of the Zodiac Killer, this history of vigilante journalism. It's not just reporters, but getting the readers involved in this search for this killer. And, you and I sort of do the same thing. Now we crowdsource some of our investigations. I'm hoping your listeners out there will think of something and they'll contact me. So they're doing the same thing with these real life murders, and they just start fudging details about how similar the MOs are in these murders, and they're really not. And they're not saying, and now there are police officers who are playing along with this to get their names in the newspaper. And the best example of this is in Napa County, September 27th, 1969. These two kids are tied up and stabbed by this guy who leaves clues behind to make people think he is this cipher slayer. He wasn't called Zodiac yet. That fact had been withheld from news coverage. He had started saying this is the Zodiac speaking in his letters. They kept that part out. But what no one, and one of the lies Graysmith told, was that the Vallejo Times Herald and other newspapers had printed the first letter before he started calling himself Zodiac. They'd printed the entire letter, life-size, photo facsimile, on the front page, hoping readers might recognize the handwriting or the style in some way. And so this guy who commits this crime out at Lake Berryessa, the one detail that might have proven it was the same guy if he had called himself Zodiac, but he didn't. And all he had done was he'd copied information that was available in the newspapers for up to 8 weeks before he committed this crime. So, and everything else about the crime is different. The MO and the weapon and all this stuff is very different. But the papers just go hook, line, and sinker, especially the Chronicle, into this, it must have been the same guy. It had to be the same guy. And now there's a police officer. Well, he's not a police officer. He's called the undersheriff. And he's not Don Townsend. He was in charge of investigation. Undersheriff Tom Johnson. He was not a cop in any sense of the word. He was a politician. And he holds this press conference where he says fingerprints from the previous murders and this murder, we got a preliminary opinion that there's a good match there. Now, in real life, that wasn't true. In real life, the fingerprints didn't match, and one of the lies Graysmith tells is they didn't get fingerprints from the Blue Rock Springs, but they did, and they did not match. They did get fingerprints from crime scenes and the letters, and they did not match. Now, they hadn't got that report back from the FBI on the day Townsend holds his news conference. And a couple days later, they finally get their report back from the FBI fingerprint lab saying there's no match anywhere. And instead of correcting the story, Townsend just says, well, I can't tell you what's in that FBI report. It's confidential information. So you have police playing along with reporters to keep this phony Zodiac serial killer story alive. And that's something that, Graysmith obviously saw, because he would see this stuff and he would use it, but he'd lie about certain pieces or change certain things. And one of the ways I figured out who the person was who actually wrote those letters was how would Tom Johnson, who he's not a fingerprint expert. He's not even really a police officer. He's just a politician. He couldn't have done any kind of preliminary fingerprint analysis. He wouldn't know what to do. So someone must have told him, hey, we think we got a match in the fingerprints here. And it wasn't the FBI. We know that because they didn't get their report for 2 more days. And it turned out he had a guy in his department, the sheriff's office in Napa County, and this was rare in those days. They had their own fingerprint and forensics expert, had their own forensics lab, and his name was Hal Snook. And then as I began to realize that the person writing these letters was using information, some of it's wrong, but he's getting it from certain police reports in some of these murder cases. And I look at who could have had access to that information. Obviously, one person that came to mind was Dave Peterson, but there was this guy in Napa who they had their own crime lab, unlike the other local police departments. And so he was receiving copies of these reports because of this effort being pushed by Mel Nicolai at California Department of Justice. Share information, share information. So he's getting these reports. And some of them they're addressed. The envelope says, or the cover letter says, attention, Deputy Hal Snook. But some of the reports he received had incorrect information that hadn't been corrected yet. And he used that information to write those letters. And the way I clinched that was I got samples of his handwriting, and it's an absolute perfect match. But the very first clue was, who could have told Tom Johnson that there was a potential match in these fingerprints that was not true? The only person who could have told him that at that time was this guy, Hal Snook. So you have Hal Snook, all these people playing along with this hoax. And, that gets into why they would do that. But this whole thing, this myth of the Zodiac Killer, and then it becomes, he's America's most famous serial killer. And of course, like Jack the Ripper, he's never caught. Mm-hmm. The thing about the Boston Strangler was they never charged anybody with those murders. When they arrested DeSalvo, it was for one of the rapes he'd committed. And it was just that Gerald Frank found out that DeSalvo had confessed to being the Boston Strangler. But investigators didn't believe him. And we know why, because the very last victim, there's a DNA match, but it's because he'd begun copycatting. And so he said, they solved this case and never told anybody. So this whole Zodiac thing supposedly fits that same mold. So he becomes more and more famous because of Graysmith's 1986 book. And then he comes out with a follow-up book where he supposedly, the guy's dead and this was his name. But then, pretty quickly, other investigators had already kind of proven Arthur Lee Allen couldn't have been the Zodiac, that Graysmith had lied about a lot of that stuff. But he told a lot more lies than even these guys like Tom Voight have ever told people. Like, he just lied basically on every page of that book. And he never dreamed anybody would ever be able to catch him on it. Now, some of the like Allen's family, Even in that movie that comes out in 2007, you've got his sister-in-law. Oh, we're worried he's a Zodiac. They never believed that. They had sued Graysmith and his publisher. A lot of police officers had sued. You know, there were people who did call him on his lies, but they end up settling out of court. You know, they take the payoff, and lots of documentary filmmakers had talked to, like Dave Tosky's partner Armstrong. Graysmith says, "Oh, he never talked to reporters." That's baloney. He would tell reporters and documentary producers and people, no, there was no connection between the murders, and the murder of this cab driver has got nothing to do with it. And one of the things I found out was that a reporter at the Chronicle had tampered with other evidence in that cab driver shooting. And then when you look at people have obtained pictures, crime lab pictures of his shirt where some pieces have been torn off and mailed in with some letters, you can see very plainly that those pieces, there's a big piece of the shirt that's still missing to this day, that apparently the killer probably did tear off the shirt and use it as a rag. But then somebody comes along and tears off 3 more pieces of the shirt. And you can tell from the pattern of bloodstains and whatnot that all this happened after the body was removed from the cab. And then it turns out that this reporter, Keith Power, he tampered with other evidence in the Stein case. And that's one of the things that the letters really call attention to. By mailing in these pieces of the shirt, what he's really doing is proving how easy it is for reporters to tamper with evidence at the San Francisco Hall of Justice. Yeah, and because it
just shows that the police aren't maintaining any chain of custody on the evidence.
Well, because in those days you had, they worked against, but also with reporters. So reporters kind of had a free run of the place, and that's one of the things that these letters. They point out some other police hanky-panky, and all that does is it just proves how easy it is, for evidence to be tampered with. And there are plenty of other cases and being covered in the Chronicle of cops tampering with evidence, other people tampering with evidence. And remember, this is exactly the same time period where the chief of police of San Francisco holds a press conference to say we have no organized crime in San Francisco, when it was organized crime money that had just built Fisherman's Wharf, that tourist area. So there's isn't
that Nancy Pelosi's father-in-law or something?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, there's definitely a connection there. And,
so there
and her, right. And then there's her, right. She has connections to the Greek mafia as well. Mm-hmm. So, right, exactly. And all these people know each other, and some of them, they're newspaper publishers or they're editors, and they're all friends, and they're all doing this. And there's one hand washes the other. You publish my fake news story, and so I'll get you another fake news story or whatever. And so this becomes America's most famous serial killer, and then all these other movies and books. And so how it becomes, it's like an hourglass. There's this massive tradition of vigilante journalism and fake news in San Francisco. And in the book, I talk about other cases, like the murder of Suzanne Degnan in Chicago after World War II, this little girl who was murdered and dismembered, and they literally found pieces of her body scattered all over the city. And they hang it on this 18-year-old kid named William Hirons. And they also try to tie him in with this other murder called the lipstick murder, where this guy had written this message on the wall, "Stop me before I kill again." And that handwriting looks, really similar to this Black Dahlia. So we think there was a lipstick killer, but what had happened in the Hirons case was this little Suzanne Degnan, her father was a government regulator, and when the war was over, they kept food rationing in place, and the Meat Packers Union was just furious because they weren't getting any overtime. And he had received death threats. He'd received threats against his family and his little girl. And so he announces 6 more months of meat rationing, and a couple days later, this little girl turns up missing. They start finding her body parts. And the medical examiner wrote in his report and testified at the coroner's inquest, he said, even a surgeon is not trained to do this type of dissection. He said this was a professional meat cutter who did this, who dismembered this body. And now you're going to have a riot on your hands. So what they do is this newspaper reporter at the Chicago, it wasn't one of the big papers. Chicago Times or something, before it was the Sun Times or something. They find this notepad. And, you know, you've seen this old trick. You'll see it in The Big Lebowski, one of my favorite movies. But you can kind of tell what somebody had written. Even though they tear off the top sheet, the impression is still. So they take this notepad back to the newspaper darkroom, not the police crime lab. And he says that there's a note underneath there that indicates that the person who used this notepad had some connection to the University of Chicago. Well, they had this kid, William Hirons, who'd been arrested for burglary, and he was a part-time janitor at the University of Chicago. Now, before this, they'd had this murder of this woman. I think she was strangled with her stockings or something, and the guy had taken the lipstick and written this note on the wall. Stop me, for God's sake, stop me before I kill again, in this weird curly handwriting. Now, the police had told reporters, they said, the fingerprints at the scene were smudged beyond all recognition. So when this reporter and this darkroom technician in the production department, now that was Graysmith's job at the Chronicle. He was not a cartoonist. He did all the darkroom work at the Chronicle. So in Chicago at this newspaper, they take this notepad, write this written correspondence, and they do some magic in the darkroom, and they prove it's connected to this William Hirons kid, because they don't want to write, you know. And so then the police call a press conference to announce that the fingerprints found at the scene of this woman with a lipstick message perfectly matched Hirons' fingerprints. Now, this is after they had publicly announced that the fingerprints were worthless. So they railroad William Hirons for being the lipstick killer. And then, of course, the lipstick killer shows up in Los Angeles, as we all know. And Hirons served more time. He served 65 years. That's the longest prison sentence that any in world history. And he didn't do it. And it was all fake news. And it was all cops conspiring with reporters and editors, right? Because they don't want the public to know who really killed Suzanne Degnan. And they have, right. So it's all this stuff kind of funnels down to this crystal case of this so-called Zodiac killer at the San Francisco Chronicle. And then it mushrooms out again into this whole phenomenon of this very popular phenomenon of the so-called serial killer. Mm-hmm. So that's what this book is about, called The Myth of the Zodiac Killer.
Yeah, and he is a literal literary figure.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, you know, the basic story. You know, there was no evidence of a serial killer, and the only evidence of a serial killer was these letters. He is a literary character. And
it ushers in the era of the serial killer.
The way people think of them, they had. Right, and it's also what I also go into in this book, a fascinating history of, speaking of these letters to the editor, you have this social political phenomenon of the insanity defense. Mm-hmm. So you have this progression of, you know, they're evil, you know, Jack the Ripper, some evil guy. It's some member of the royal family getting his kicks by, you know, the thrill killer. Then it turns into this pathetic psychopathic killer, the psycho killer that you see in the movie M with Peter Lorre. I just can't help myself, right? That whole Freudian, you're supposed to feel sorry for the killer. Now, audiences and readers and voters got sick of this. So you have this dialogue going on the letters to the editor's page. You have both readers, you have psychiatrists, and you have like this Richard Stark, murdered all these nurses. And this has become...
sorry. Was that Richard Speck, right?
Richard Speck. Yeah. Murdered these nurses and whatnot. So you had these stories running in the Saturday Evening Post, which was the #1 magazine, newspapers, Life magazine, where they're doing this. And even in this movie, The Boston Strangler, right, they present this Albert DeSalvo as kind of pathetic character. And again, they turn the monster into a victim almost. You're supposed to feel more sorry for the killer. And audiences were just furious about this. So you see this dialogue, and you see doctors writing these letters to the editor of these magazines, you know, I'm canceling my subscription because of this. And it just, at this perfect time. And what I show in the book, using this highfalutin academic language, right, you build up this character that the audience, that the readers, that the culture demands. And you're just waiting for him to appear. They've already got him outlined, and they're just waiting. And then, as if by magic, a few months later, they get these letters from this guy who is clearly not insane. He's completely rational. He takes full responsibility for what he's done. It's everything they've been looking for, and they've already drawn up a pretty good sketch of this perfect tabloid killer. And lo and behold, here he pops up right at that moment, and he becomes the archetype for the pop culture figure of the serial killer, right down to Dexter and all these. So.
Yeah. Now, that's interesting because now you're suggesting sort of a dialectic. To what extent this is deliberate is the question, because you have the politics of the era, too, what's going on in the Vietnam War, the counterculture, the turmoil of the 60s, and this is playing into a political dialectic, particularly you mentioned in your book, the great silent majority that's going to vote for Nixon, because they want to be protected from these from crime. And of course, the idea that the criminals are being coddled by a liberal system. And then in 1971, Hollywood comes out with Dirty Harry. Right. And the inaugural Dirty Harry, the first one, involves a Zodiac type killer called the Scorpio Killer. It's just one of these is a serial killer who's very cold and deliberative. And you need a no-nonsense, take no prisoners, shoot first cop like Dirty Harry to clean the streets, to protect us.
Right. And hey, I love that movie as much as anybody. Mm-hmm. That's a fantastic movie.
Oh, they're great.
But
it
reflects, and Death Wish, right? These vigilante movies. Well, this had been a building phenomenon. And it's always been a phenomenon, the vigilante journalist. But this whole, it's just as if by magic, right when you have this need. And it isn't just, it's a vague need among the public, and it's a very specific need among these editors and publishers for a tabloid killer. And the other problem with other serial killers is once they get caught, the story goes away. And the other perfect thing about the Zodiac killer is he's never caught, so the story never goes away. And it's just a miracle that he shows up right at that time. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then I go on in two other books to show that the whole thing was a hoax. The murders were real, but the serial killer and the letters, that's all a big hoax. But it's become so influential. And we've even rewritten case histories of previous serial killers like Jack the Ripper, who also apparently never existed, to fit the new stereotype, this new archetypal character of the rational, responsible, evil serial killer. We go back to the monster who's legally, ethically, and morally responsible for what he's done.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Now, you're talking about narrative. Sort of these narratives are a literary creation. We have other examples. I think. Obviously, the Charles Manson case is has been subjected to some real revision, and the standard narrative has been checked, has been questioned. His character is somewhat of a literary character, a creation of Vincent Bugliosi, and there are those people who have scrutinized that case and found something to be very different. Like what we had going on there was likely a drug burn. He himself was operating car chopping, prostitution, and a drug running operation out of the Spawn Ranch. And, and his idea of this cult leader who could brainwash and turn his family, his members, acolytes, into zombified murderers. There's simply no evidence for that, and people look
and Charles Manson himself is a storyteller and a poet and a songwriter.
Yes, yeah, and that might explain some reason for the cover-up, because he got very close to the Beast Boys, particularly Dennis Wilson, and so there's a lot of PR cover-up, and there's suggesting if LAPD had really invested that case, and LAPD really is a corporate police department, it protects the industry of Los Angeles, which is Hollywood. if they had really investigated that case thoroughly, they would have found a pedophile ring, porno tapes, bestiality tapes, child trafficking, drug abuse by a lot of Hollywood A-listers, and they simply couldn't expose that truth, so they spun this narrative. And there's some question about Charles Manson himself, because by the time he had been arrested in 1969, he had spent half his life in prison and institutions, and his connections to Scientology and also the Process Church, alleged, is kind of a tantalizing bit of evidence suggesting that perhaps there's some sort of perhaps manipulation or mind control, even tying it to MK Ultra, because Scientology itself has been closely linked to the intelligence agencies, and the exploitation or use of cults by the intelligence agencies is well documented. So some people have gone that route, but nevertheless, the official narrative is bogus. It's a fantasy.
Well, not only that, you brought up two very interesting and very important points. The first one is the case, the evidence is mostly the stories that Susan and the other girls told detectives in Bugliosi. They tell the story of the Manson family. There's no other real evidence. They rely on these stories these girls tell them. Mm-hmm. Now, it turns out that part of the myth is that they chose these victims at random, but there's one of the other girls, what was her name? She let it slip that, for example, they did specifically target this guy. He was an actor from Cyprus. Now, there may be a connection, and Dave Peterson went to his grave swearing he had uncovered more and more connections between Manson and Zodiac, and I think he may have been right. And that's kind of the new stuff, and we'll be talking about that on the Stones Unturned podcast. But the main thing is, part of the myth was that they're just a bunch of crazy druggies, and they go out randomly killing people. But no, they had information from some of the girls who said, "Oh no, we specifically targeted specific people." That's where Bugliosi then comes out, realizes that this was a big con job. So it was almost their entire case was just the stories that they were told by some of the girls. And then the second part of that, the Dave Peterson uncovering that, he uncovered a lot of that these were basically Charles was someone known to them, and this seems to be, there is a pattern to this. There are other cases like this. He's kind of a loose cannon, and they can just kind of point him at certain people they want done away with, and Charles doesn't even really know why he's doing what he's doing. Or who's really putting him up to it, because it turns out that LaBianca and Polanski are involved in these big cocaine deals. Yeah. These are not randomly selected victims at all.
J. Sebring International, yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And
exactly.
Who's the other guy? Wojtek Rakowski and Abigail Folger and all that they were all involved in this scene. And I believe LaBianca's wife ran like a boutique shop that she had unexplained wealth. Which those shops are often used, for money fronts for these things. The cash is funneled through them.
Of course. Well, and I mean that's how John DeLorean raised the money to build his car. Let's do a cocaine deal, right? And then you have the other people Charlie hung out with. They're all storytellers and bards. So you get all this myth that comes up. And, of course, they're very convincing liars. They're all professional actors and singers and songwriters. They're professional liars. They're professional myth makers. Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. So as I've been checking into this and this Hal Snook guy and why he may have done this, I've made these just massive tectonic discoveries over the past summer about Hal Snook and his background and why he may have written those letters and who they're really addressed to and who those cryptograms are really addressed to. And then in addition to that, and part of that, as I find out more and more about him, when you look at those Zodiac letters and cryptograms, he uses a lot of these weird symbols, and people have argued about where they come from, what they mean. They all come from exactly one source. And I have found it, and there's absolutely no doubt about it whatsoever. So when you see this documentary that was just on, the guy's using this supercomputer, and there's this Dave Orenchak, kind of these amateur cryptologists. I was really hoping they had made some progress confirm what I have found out. I am 99.99% sure I know exactly who that, especially the 340, the uncrackable cryptogram. I know who that was addressed to, and I'm pretty sure I know, in broad terms, the information that's in it. I'm not quite ready to announce that publicly. I'm sorry, and I apologize to your listeners. I want to get one more piece of confirmation before it come out with this. And I'm having some experts look at what I have found in terms of these symbols. And I'm hoping, and I tell people, Hal Snook had been one of those behind-the-lines commandos, OSS type guys during World War II.
So it's like an anthropologist in many ways.
Well, and he had, in his experiences fighting against the Japanese in the Far East and the connections he made. And I fell out of my chair who some of the people were that he was friends with, that he had addressed those cryptograms to and what they're about. Because he had become like one of the nation's top experts, not just in narcotics prosecution, but like he could identify which lab had produced which batch of meth and things like that. He was a self-taught chemist. He was an amazing guy. He was this unbelievable, amazing guy. And I think he actually had a good reason for doing what he did. It wasn't a prank and it wasn't a joke. And some people who knew him have contacted me and said, well, you don't know the real Hal Snook. He hung out with some real creeps and pedophiles and people like that. And I've told people like, well, to do what he did, he'd have to. You have to swim in the sewer if you're going to catch the turds, basically. Yeah. So I'm pretty sure I know exactly what he was up to, and I can tell you and your listeners, it absolutely has a lot to do with the CIA smuggling heroin out of the Golden Triangle. That's exactly what those letters and cryptograms touch on.
Interesting. Right.
And I think I know. And the 340, I think I specifically know exactly the information that's in that, and I do know exactly who it was addressed to. And that was why it had to be printed on the front page of the Chronicle, because he couldn't take the risk of contacting this guy directly. This was somebody he knew for a long time. So
this was a form of tradecraft, kind of communicating, like they do in the
absolutely
ads? That's interesting.
Well, if you watch a show like Hogan's Heroes, for example, you'll be listening to BBC News broadcast, because embedded in that broadcast will be a coded message. And the Nazis know that too. They're also listening to this. They know that they do the same thing, that you can plant, or if you see the movie 3 Days of the Condor, that's based on a real thing, that they're trying to read every newspaper, magazine, and book, looking for secret agents may have embedded coded messages in these things.
Yeah, he reads everything.
Right, and that's actually based on an actual technique that is still used to this day. And there's the simple, maybe it's in a personal ad, maybe it's in something, right, that they're embedding coded messages. Well, he was trained not only in using these techniques when he was one of these agents, but he was training these guerrilla fighters. He was training like Ho Chi Minh's Viet Cong guerrilla fighters and people. And he mainly worked in New Guinea and Mindanao. And by the way, the tribe he worked with in New Guinea were the same people who apparently did away with that Rockefeller. Who was the Rockefeller who went there and disappeared?
That's right.
Probably the same. They probably ate him, actually. But and then in Mindanao.
Well, that's karma. That's karma. Rockefeller
yeah, exactly. Well, maybe
that was Nelson's son, I think. Yeah,
Nelson's son, and maybe he had an ulterior motive for going there, and maybe it blew up his face. Yeah. But when Snook was doing this, he was teaching them, the fundamental cryptography and things that they could use, and also how to build roadside bombs using materials that were available. Fertilizer, diesel fuel, right? Using the technologies available to them. He's teaching them to do these things. And so and then it turns out, right, where he got a lot of these special symbols.
So you're saying Hal Snook's posting these things, he's using the Zodiac just as a vehicle to post these messages. Nothing to do with the Zodiac case.
Purpose. No. Well, he's also, the funny thing is, these letters call attention to some rather strange police reports and certain police officers who look pretty shaky.
Interesting, yeah.
And look pretty shady. And, crooked narcotics officers. But mainly it's to guarantee. Now, and then it also turns out that there's a connection between him and Robert Graysmith that goes way back to when Graysmith was a kid. They knew each other. They knew each other from way back. And using his position, his job at the Chronicle, as Graysmith himself says in his own book, that it seemed like the guy writing these letters might have worked in the production department of a newspaper. He had access to comic strips weeks before they're published and crossword puzzles and things. Well, you know what? That guy was Robert Graysmith.
Yeah.
And so they have this two-way communication channel. And the other end of that channel was Paul Avery, because in the late 60s, Paul Avery had gone to the Far East and he set up a wire service, and he only ran it for a couple of years. But that was how this guy could get messages back to Snook, because you can't guarantee any one particular story will be published in a newspaper, but as long as there's an employee at that newspaper who has access to the wire teletypes, these stories will come through. And that's where, and these have coded messages, and he can pass these along to Snook, and then Snook can create these cryptograms and bizarre letters and get them published in the front page of the Chronicle, which is distributed worldwide, and this guy in the Far East can get it. It's going to be a few days old, but it has these messages. So I know who they're addressed to, and I'm pretty sure I know generally what it's all about, and I think I know exactly what it's about, because I can see, and I'm sorry to be such a tease and hold this back. I'm looking to confirm a couple things. Well, you know me, well, I don't publish something unless I can prove it 6 ways for Sunday. So
that's this type of method. Because are you familiar with the Kurt Vonnegut story, Mother Night?
Oh, I read that a long time ago.
Yeah, Nick Nolte played him in the movie. It's a he is a writer who is then recruited by the OSS before the war to be a pro-Nazi, American expatriate pro-Nazi propagandist, producing radio messages, propaganda messages to hurt the morale of the Allied forces. And of course, he also has a German bride. So he poses as a Nazi throughout a pro-Nazi American throughout the war, and his job is to send out these propaganda messages, but embedded in those messages would be code about certain intelligence matters, since he was well trusted by the Nazi hierarchy. And of course, the war ends, and the U.S. soldiers that capture know him, identify him as his propagandist. They see him as a traitor, so they rough him up, beat him up. At the last minute, his OSS contact, in the movie it's played by John Goodman, says, well, we'll get you some cash and get you out of here, no problem, but only 3 people know about you, and one of them just died. Of course, that's FDR. This is April 1945. And he goes, well, what about me? I mean, you're going to tell me what I'm doing? I've been playing this part for 6 years. What are you going to do? He says, we can't tell anybody. It's we can't give up sources and methods, and so you're a man without a country, but we can, get you. You can, sort of like paperclip you out of the situation. Right. Then years later in the '60s, he gets caught up in it again and gets exposed, and he ends up being on trial next to his cell next to Adolf Eichmann or something.
Oh yeah.
So it's but that's kind of what he was doing, embedding these stories, and it's typical Kurt Vonnegut type story,
right. Well, the reason he wrote Slaughterhouse-Five was he was in a psychiatric ward, and there was a guy in there who was shooting his mouth off about the book he was going to write about the bombing of Dresden.
Oh yeah.
And Vonnegut was like, I was there. I was one of the POWs who cleaned up the rubble, and you're full of shit. And so Vonnegut writes Slaughterhouse-Five because this was a big secret. It was top secret. The bombing of Dresden was top secret, and this guy wrote this book supposedly. I think it's the same people did. So these are known techniques. And see, Snook would have met a lot of these people. They had been like Chennault, although Chennault pronounced it Chenault, and the Flying Tigers, who become Air America. They've been flying heroin in and out of Burma since 1937. And these are the same people.
That's that King Kong connection you talked about earlier. Right?
Well, right, and we go into that a lot deeper. Marion C. Cooper is connected to those people, and these are the people who are flying people like Hal Snook in and out of, behind enemy lines to do what they do. So he met all those people. And there were people who, but long before I ever mentioned this, there were people who had contacted me and said, oh, Hal used to brag about he knew CIA agents and all this other stuff. And I'm finding out, yeah, he really did. And there's one in particular that's just going to blow your mind. And it just blew my mind. And it's just, he's such a, I want to write a book about him. He was such a badass, and he was so odd. He would start this business. Like, he took over 2 small town newspapers for a couple of years, went broke. I'm like, why did he do that? Well, because he wanted to learn everything there was to know about the newspaper business. Mm-hmm. And just things like that he didn't seem to care about the money. He was a rock hound, and when he retired, he would go to Montana, Wyoming, and he would dig these fossils. I used to own one of the fossils that these fossil fish that he would find. I used to own one of those. Guy's just fascinating. So I think he actually used his powers for good and not for evil. I think he used this Zodiac hoax. A lot of people have said, we think he was up to no good, and maybe he did have a dark side. That is possible.
Well, in that line of work, I don't know how you can't, be morally compromised, and there's all types of moral compromises you make in that line of work. I mean,
right. You can't pick up fleas unless you lie down with dogs. Yeah. I mean, you can't do that kind of work unless you can't infiltrate. The Hell's Angels are a notorious example. And speaking of Solano County and Napa County, they had cops they were undercover cops infiltrated the Hell's Angels, and they got so deep into it they eventually left the police department, became full-time Angels, just because you can't get out of it. You get in so deep you can't get out. So it works both ways, and he may have been one of those people. It is true, he did spend an awful lot of time with boys, and he did hang around with people who were sexual predators. There's no doubt about it. And he may have been one. Who knows? And he may have gotten a taste for killing people when he was doing this behind the lines.
Yeah.
So it's hard to. But I think
the war always comes home. That's
Yeah, exactly. But I do think for the most part, I do think he tended to use his powers for good and stuff. Although it was not a completely successful plan on his part, it was partly successful. And that I'm starting, to double check a lot of that. What were the results of this stunt that he pulled? And another thing that's important to remember is after those first 4 letters, someone else takes over writing the letters. The handwriting's completely different. The personality's different. They no longer have access. And it's because I think they got caught or he was done by October of 1969. And so I think he did back away from that. And I think Graysmith helped him actually produce the actual cryptograms. I don't think Hal Snook actually held the pen creating those cryptograms. I think he gave the information, passed the information to Graysmith. I think Graysmith actually did create the cryptograms. There's a lot of reasons for thinking that. But there's a very good chance we'll be able to at least partly decrypt the 340, and who knows. And I tell people, it might not be much information in it. It may just be that the number of symbols, the number of characters, 340, that might be the only information that needed to be transmitted. Who knows? It might be a pattern if there are only certain letters that needed to be. One of the things that I can't believe these people haven't noticed, when he signed those letters, he used it. This is the Zodiac speaking, and see, that may have been his code name. It may have been his call sign when he was an agent. I don't know, but like, for example, in some of the letters, there's this weird little. You can't tell for sure if it's a circled figure 8, or some people think it looks like a little bull's head, like maybe he's a Taurus. Well, the outfit that he was in, the Philippine Scouts in the 12th Infantry Division, that commando unit, that was their shoulder patch. It was water buffalo's head with the horn in a circle, and that goes the circled crosshair symbol. Is evocative of several symbols would be associated with this. And when you do electronic, any kind of, even if it's electromechanical, like, for example, the Enigma machine, or we had a much more sophisticated version of that technology called Sigaba that Hal Snook was trained to use. It's the logical operation of NOR, not OR. You take the Bado code, which was the original 5-bit code for teletype and telegraph, which has been expanded to 8 bits for ASCII, but the method is the same. You have the ones and zeros, the binary version of each letter of the alphabet, and then you have a key stream. You don't want to use the same key letter over and over. You have a stream, and you perform the logical operation of not on these two binary numbers. You get a third binary number, and then that's your encrypted text. Where you take the encrypted text and you perform the exact same operation using the same key stream, and it reverses the process and goes back to the original message. And the way that process works, and that symbol, the symbol for NOR is a circle with a plus. The circle crosshair symbol.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's a clue to the person who's receiving this message. This is the operation you're seeing. Now, the trick is you have to transmit the key stream in the clear. And I think I know how they did that. I think I know how he transmitted the key stream that would be separate from the crypt text. So I'm just working with some experts to see if we can. I'm not quite an expert. I know a lot about it. I don't know enough. And the weird thing is you can get a free app for Windows that not only is an Enigma emulator, it's actually a Sigma 500 emulator, which is much, so you can actually do this. I just need a little bit of help, and I think I know, because you need that key stream, and I think I know where it is. Now, something that they did, and I think they stole this from me, but maybe not. I'm the one who pointed out that there may be invisible ink in some of those letters and cryptograms, because one of the famous letters, he says, my name is, and there's this, I think it's 13 characters, cryptogram, supposed to be his name. There's a big blank space around all that. And then later in that letter, he says, I'm mildly serious about how much money you have on my head. And everybody said, well, this is some bizarre spelling of the word curious. No, it's a perfectly spelled word. Cirrus oxalate is no one had heard of that outside the spook community. That was an invisible ink that was used up until the 1990s when some retired KGB agents wrote a book and talked about it. Cirrus oxalate is a chemical that had a lot of uses. Before Dramamine, it was used to treat motion sickness and altitude sickness, and it was given to paratroopers and sailors. And it also had it was also called kamikaze juice because it lowered your fear of death, so you'd be willing to jump out of the airplane. But it's also used if you're a kid, you ever had those little machines you'd polish rocks, the rock polishing thing.
Oh yeah.
The polish is cirrus oxalate. So these spies, these agents, if you got caught with it, you could just tell your interrogator, well, that's my seasickness medicine, and they would believe you because they didn't know it could be used as invisible ink.
Oh, okay.
And as they point out on their documentary, like I pointed out a couple of years ago, you can see it looks like they accidentally washed it away with an anhydrine trying to detect fingerprints. It looks like there was a message written in invisible ink on at least that letter, because you can see his handwriting. His capital letter A is not a TP with a cross across it. It's actually kind of a barn. So it goes up and then over at an angle to a peak and down and down. So it's more like a barn than an A. And you can see that pretty clearly on that one letter when you look at it in Photoshop. But whether it had any other message that was there. And the funny thing is, in that some people have said, Kane, my name, or whatever. If you get rid of that extra A, which there's an A written in invisible ink, maybe there were other letters, we don't know, but you can see that very clearly, a capital letter A written in an invisible ink. If you throw that A out, then you get Ken is my name, and Hal Smith's middle name was Kenneth. Yeah, so if you get rid of that extra A, well, and then at the end of the 408, which is the one that was easy to crack, there's a string of some people argue about how many letters it is in the string, but Graysmith claimed it spelled out Robert Emmett the hippie, and it doesn't. It actually spells out Pobert E. Smith II. And Robert Gray Smith's real name is Robert G. Smith II. So there's a lot of, read the books, folks. I promise they're worth reading. There was a lot of information there, and it's all. There's really no room for doubt. So these more recent discoveries we'll be talking about on the Stones Unturned podcast, and I'll let you know when I'm ready to it's absolutely blockbuster, and I just want to get that last confirmation, that last corroboration before I actually go public with it. So.
Now, with the of course, with the Zodiac, we case how this is sort of a misdirection for several reasons. One is perhaps cover up local corruption, political corruption, maybe human trafficking or pedophile networks and these things that are going on there. Another thing.
Well, because it turns out now there's something to this, because another thing I write about in my book, The Great Zodiac Killer Hoax of 1969, is who the real suspects were in each of those murders. Contrary to the myth, they did have very good suspects. Mm-hmm. And they are all connected to Hal Snook. Darlene Ferrin's ex-husband really is the prime suspect in her murder. And a lot of people have told me he was friends with Hal Snook. And then it goes back further than that he may have been some of Darlene's friends and relatives had said that they thought she and Jim had gone to the Virgin Islands and gotten involved in some drug deals and had witnessed a murder. Well, that overlaps absolutely perfectly with these de Grimstons and this offshoot of this Process Church. Mm-hmm. And they were disciples of Crowley. And so, there's kind of a tie in there. And another suspect, the real suspect in the Paul Stein killing, sounds like, no connection. It's this guy. He was a recent immigrant from Jordan. These Cypriot Christians who were fleeing like the 6 Days War and whatnot. Some from Cyprus, some from Jordan, some from Lebanon. And a bunch of them end up in San Francisco, and they all work at the Pinecrest Diner. And this guy's name was Hashim Syed. And he was the guy apparently who was robbing all those cabs that summer, and then he's robbing Paul Stein, and probably the gun went off by accident. Mm-hmm. But the funny thing is, he came over on the same boat as this actor who was one of the real targets of the Manson family murders. And the girl, they couldn't find his apartment, or she decided she didn't want him to get killed. So he came over. One of the intended victims of the Manson family came over on the same boat with the guy who's the actual suspect in the Paul Stein murder case.
Wow.
So, and he was eventually convicted of murdering one of his coworkers with a .380 pistol who worked at the Pinecrest Diner. So, and of course he looks exactly like the composite sketch of the guy the witnesses saw getting out of the taxi. So there are these connections that are starting to, as documents become available for people to see, they scan every scrap of paper that was ever printed and it ends up on the internet, and people find this stuff. And the crowdsourcing does work. Listeners do contact us with tips that very often do pay off. So, by all means, folks, no matter how crazy, even if you think I'm crazy and I'm wrong, lay it on me. What have you got? What do you think I've done wrong? And we will check it out. So
yeah, there's a vigilante journalism angle with the Manson case. One thing that I learned fairly recently is that the pistol, the .22 caliber pistol that was used at the Cielo Drive residence, was given to a ranch hand, the Spahn Ranch. A stuntman at the Spahn Ranch, because that's where they used to film these westerns. It once belonged to Ronald Reagan, the then governor, and then, of course, for future president of the United States.
Wow. See?
And that gun, the police didn't find it. A young boy found it, reported to his father. They turned it into the police. Then the police claimed to have lost it for whatever reason. And then they raised a stink with the press. And that's when the police had to admit they had it. They found it. but it's not really reported. You don't really get the story because you think that'd be a sensational story that the pistol that was used once belonged to the then governor, of course, future President of the United States, Ronald Reagan.
Right.
But it also turns out that among some of the films they had were apparently was like a porno film with Jane Wyman, the ex-wife of the governor.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's been, a lot of people like John Huston and there's this, it's still around today. I don't want to get too far off topic, but there's this Eastern mystical belief, treating children like adults and the child bride thing and sexualizing children, and people like some members of the McCormick family and these people, they buy into that. And they do end up in Hollywood. And the people who start the Esalen Institute, you mean? Right. They come from that same tradition.
Which is ties to the intelligence agencies and Tavistock and things like that institute.
Absolutely. And right down to, you've got the Weinsteins and then it also turns out, again, loose lips sink ships, but there are people who've worked for Castle Rock Entertainment involved in this. And so now you're talking about Rob Reiner. Now you're talking about Jerry Seinfeld. You're talking about some of the – I'm not saying all of them. I'm not saying specifically, Jerry Seinfeld's going to be caught up in this. What I'm saying is, Castle Rock Entertainment. And these go back a long way, the people who start these companies. And some of them, apparently John Huston, they raise their own kids in this culture.
And this ties back to the Black Dahlia, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And even before that, because some of these people who either put money into early movie studios or the theater chains. See, RKO started out as a conglomerate of vaudeville theaters, the radio chain of theaters, the Keith and Orpheum, and they all merged into RKO. And then because originally what you had, the movie studios, they had a hard time finding theaters that would show their movies. And so they started buying up chains of vaudeville theaters. And this RKO chain, now they sort of just kind of have their own movie studio. So they produce. So instead of having different TV channels, what you would do is you'd have an RKO theater in your town. You'd have a Warner Brothers theater in your town. You just go from theater to theater and see the entertainment they're putting up. So RKO goes way back to vaudeville, and some of these people, some of these investors, and some of these, the girl in the red velvet swing, some of these rich businessmen, they'd been doing business in India, or so, they pick up this cult, or they pick up culture, or they were disciples of Crowley, or they're disciples of Madame Blavatsky, and they pick up this culture. Not everyone in those movements is necessarily a pedophile, but a lot of them were, apparently.
Yeah.
And that includes involving your own children and sometimes marrying your own daughters. This whole weird, a lot of them really were into this weirdness. And apparently John Huston is a member of this circle of people, like you said, making porno with Jane. These they're kind of home sex tapes, and some of them go further than that in some of the stuff that they were doing.
Mm-hmm. And a creep like Crowley would be very useful for the British Empire because he was well versed in some of the Eastern mysticism, the culture, the ways, and we all know that intelligence agencies have are very interested in anthropology for purposes of infiltration and also exploitation. These things, exploiting myths and
the Mountbattens, Louis Mountbatten.
Yes.
I mean, Louis Mountbatten was apparently raised in this culture because he grew up there. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it's not just Crowley. And really, Crowley didn't even start this. He's just kind of like second generation inducted into this.
It's also ways to ensure a stable of reliable psychopaths because you can shatter someone's psyche. They don't develop normal empathy, these things, and these people become perfect agents if you want to run a global empire and do the things that are necessary to maintain.
Well, and it's also a way. It's also a way of the Nazis were very practiced at this. The SS. It's a way of screening and recruiting people.
Yeah,
and it's you're testing them, and you're also and politics works like this, and not just sex and murder, but it's called mutual assured blackmail.
Mm-hmm.
You're not gonna form a political alliance with somebody unless you got something on them, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. Everybody can hang everybody else. That's how politics works. And the higher up you go, the more intense that gets. That's why people and the media are going on and on and on about Mueller and these people. They haven't said one word about the Podestas, who have just dropped out of sight because they own Media Matters and they're friends with the publishers of they know all of these people, and you're not hearing one word about it. But maybe we'll do another episode on this. Mm-hmm. A bunch of people getting arrested, and the funny thing is, some of the people associated with the Podestas and NSA and all of this, their kids and their grandchildren have been dying mysteriously in the last couple of months. These weird accidents and unexplained deaths, and ever since the shit started to stick to the Podestas, all of a sudden a lot of these people have ended up dead.
Who was that singer that looked just like John Podesta?
Oh, well, there may be something to that. That's not a totally unrealistic.
Lincoln Park, right? Lincoln Park.
Yeah, the guy from Lincoln Park. I knew those guys. I used to, because I've worked in media, and
he looks like John Podesta.
In a comedian. So we used to all hang out in Sacramento. This was right before they got big, and everybody had headed to Sacramento, and we're sitting around, who's going to make it big, and everybody thought we all thought we were all fans of this band called Mood Stack, and at the last minute it's Lincoln Park who make it big. So I used to set this club. I'd get off comedy as early, and then I'd go to this rock and roll club next door and sit there with the guys from Lincoln Park, and we'd watch bands like Mood Stack and party. And
well, I guess Mood Stack didn't have the bloodline.
Well, it's just hip hop kind of. Mood Stack was more of a heavy metal band, mm-hmm. like Pearl Jam, mm-hmm. and Linkin Park they had a little bit more of the hip hop feel, kind of like Beastie Boys and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And that's it's just there's luck and there's all this other stuff. So
yeah,
when I saw that, and I'm like, and the people, he was adopted apparently, and so this is possible, mm-hmm. right? It is actually possible.
He looks like it's like.
Right, he looks exactly like him.
It's like what's that guy on MSNBC looks like, just like Frank Sinatra.
Well, now and all joking aside, Chelsea Clinton is the absolute spitting image of Webb Hubbell.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah, right. And that's always been the rumor. And I'll give Bill credit. He raised her as his own, and he has no other children, which is interesting. Mm-hmm. But yeah, everybody has always said she has to be Webb's kid. Why would Hillary, she was hot when she was younger. What she was doing sleeping with, how did Webb Hubbell how did he have sex with Hillary Clinton? That's what I want to know. That's what I want to know. But, Bill had a hard time getting her to marry him, and it had a lot to do with he could introduce her to the McCormick family. And that's part of where that connection is.
The McCormick family is the owner of.
Well, it's McCormick Spices and McCormick.
That's what I thought. Okay.
Cultural. They go way back. They go way back to almost the Lincoln administration.
Is that the Reaper too? The farm equipment, and all that.
Right. He invented that the first mechanical reaper in Chicago, Illinois, and then he becomes he and some other people. They become there was no Secretary of Agriculture, but the Lincoln administration, especially the Andrew Johnson administration, they travel. They're traveling to India, and they travel all over the world looking for crops to bring back, or looking for. I think they're the ones who brought back Russian winter wheat, and they go looking for. I think they brought hemp, and they bring a lot of crops to see if they'll grow here, or to see looking for different cash crops, and that's how they encounter. And then one of their daughters gets really into this cult, this Indian cult, the pedophilia and all this stuff. Mm-hmm. And she's one of the ones who, she gives all this money to Marion Wright Edelman to write these laws that, to not just child liberation, but also to empower governments to, take custody of children. And she's a big early patroness of Hillary Clinton's political career. So
yeah, and Bill Clinton signs that law in the 90s about with Child Protective Services. Federal funding of bonuses for adoption.
Right. Chelsea had been working on that. Hillary had been working on that even before she met Bill.
Mm-hmm.
So that was all Hillary's idea, and her being hooked up with Marion Wright Edelman and some of these other people. Absolutely. And I don't think Hillary herself personally approves of some of this stuff. Power, she's all about power, and she's just one of those. She's almost a sociopath. I mean, somebody who will just do whatever it takes to get power and just turns a blind eye to everything else.
Well, yeah, morally, from a human standpoint, there's no difference between fomenting a civil war in Syria or Libya or Ukraine than it is to facilitating human trafficking to get a $100 million donation to your foundation, right? Either way, it's just, yeah.
And Bill, I've seen serious, he scores 20 out of 20 on the sociopath test.
Yeah.
And she scores like 19 out of 20. And they're just a marriage made in heaven. But the Nazis did the same thing. It was you had sociopaths who, when they were recruiting SS officers in particular, a list of virtues, and it's what we now call the sociopath, or what's the other word for it? The person with no conscience.
Yeah.
We're kind of
and then of course they were recruited to form our new CIA. So there you go.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Some of them. Well, and Roman Polanski. Yeah. Roman Polanski, because he had those connections to Polish politicians.
Yeah.
He's not just a filmmaker. He is a brilliant filmmaker, but he's also obviously right. And you're making deals with the devil, and
he makes a movie about that.
Well, he does, and he knew a lot of those people firsthand, and they do show up as characters in his movie.
And the movie in your book, you write about how this sort of raises the hysteria of satanic cults and these things, and
right?
That's going to feed into these things, and of course these cults, like people like Aleister Crowley, are intelligence assets. So there's some truth to these things, but at the same time, the film itself, and way it's been explained to me is it sort of explains what you have to do to attain success in Hollywood is sell your soul, right? That's
well, and there's and it's also I've been around show business all my life. There's kind of this. It's not just a casting couch, and it is. There is just this plain old, it's power and sex, but there's also this. If you can't seduce me, how are you going to seduce a million ticket buyers? There's that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also the people like the Adlers who raise children like Patty Duke and Marilyn Monroe and sexually abuse them to make them into better actors. And Marlon Brando said they're trying to do that crap with him, and he got away from them.
Well, the method acting is like mind control. That's
right, and those not every
and all that stuff.
Right, not all of them do that. However, the Strasbergs apparently did, and they apparently did it with some of their young actors, and it's right. So
I'm really disturbed by how good childhood acting has become, because what that suggests to me is going on.
And even if it isn't specifically sexual, it's horrible.
Yeah,
it's
It's like there's childhood athletes, like what's in the news today is about the abuse of the women's gymnastic team. But what's described to me the life of an Olympic gymnast is to me abuse.
Mm-hmm.
Even if she isn't being sexually abused by her doctor, or just that, why would you shoot a child such a certain ability? And they're literally selling that child's, that person's childhood for this success. And,
even the ones who don't make it, look at JonBenet Ramsey, look at that little subculture, and it's, I don't really deal with that directly, but it's a fringe in show business. And then you have that coach at Penn State, the one who, and Paterno turning a blind eye to it because it's a small enough price to pay for a national championship, right?
Yeah.
The people who enable, maybe they don't approve, but they've got skin in the game and they turn a blind eye. Or sometimes, in show business in particular, and I've dealt with people who are not monsters, but who are odd and who they have these angelic talents, but they're crazy. But you put up with that. You put up with that because it isn't just money either. I mean, when you're sitting there and this person or these two people, they pick up a guitar and they're writing a song and it's a great song and you're there when it's being created and the hair is standing up on the back of your neck. You put up with a lot of crazy bullshit.
Yeah.
To get to that magic moment. Now, I've never turned a blind eye to somebody assaulting someone, but if it's drugs or their weird doll collection, whatever it is, whatever the craziness is that you got to put up with to get to that magic moment, you do. And I can see a logic there that there are people who they've got a mansion they're trying to pay for, and once you agree to it once, you just can't. It's like a mafia. It's like any other mafia. But there are a lot of people who get into it. There's no doubt they get into it. And that's a shame. So when you see these, and they'll use up a child and throw them away because they have their own goal that they're working toward, and they have all kinds of excuses. And the thing about Satanism is it gives you a valid excuse. It tells you it's okay to do this. It's Nietzsche.
Do it thou wilt. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And you have to have some kind of, you can't call yourself a Christian and go to a church, and you certainly can't go to a church like a Catholic church and sit there in that pew or talk to that priest and do the things that these people do. You have to have some other alternative religion that tells you it's okay.
Yeah.
You have to have something like that. So,
now getting back the whole thing, the misdirection, the whole hoax thing. I've done some interviews, read a few books. There's a book, Steven Singular, he wrote a book, A Legacy of Deception, about the O.J. Simpson case. And if you get into that case, one thing, the police planted evidence, and that's why he was acquitted on, was the blood evidence. That didn't. There's a suggestion, a lot of like the Manson case. If you really dig into that case and get just beyond the official narrative, although he was acquitted, but the story is that the jury was race baited or something, and they acquitted unanimously because they were afraid, and the prosecution blew the case in these things. But seems to be suggested in that case is that there was a drug angle, like in the Manson case. Nicole Simpson was involved in some drug dealing at that restaurant, and so was Goldman. And Goldman's family, actually, his ties to, like, I think his mother had married a lawyer who was a big mob lawyer for drug dealers, things like that. But the thing is, the reason why O.J. Simpson couldn't marshal a positive defense was because he himself was involved in drug dealing. He had been investigated back in Buffalo in his playing days, and he was sort of one who facilitated these drugs to professional athletes, these stars. And it's one of these things where the counter-narcotics officers will wink and nod at it because he's giving drugs to celebrities. No one wants to arrest these celebrities. And what happened was, if they were to investigate that case fully and thoroughly, they would have exposed a lot of the corruption, which was exposed subsequently in the Rampart scandal.
Right, and even if the murder of Nicole and Ron had nothing to do with that, investigating that murder would have uncovered that, and that's what happens. That's just like this whole this supposed Trump collusion thing. As soon as names like Podesta come up, that's when all of a sudden there's a gag order.
Yeah. It's funny.
Right. These investigations, once you turn on the light, you're going to see a lot of cockroaches.
Yeah. But that little things like, the witnesses in the plane didn't see any cut on his hand. And that's out there. But the media covers it up. There were 2 knives used. Ronald Goldman had been tortured first before he was cut. the original medical examiner identified 2 weapons, and he was taken off the case and these things. So it's and it always gets into this character of Furman and his the true nature of Furman. Apparently, he knew Nicole Simpson prior to these, intimately knew her, meaning that she knew some intimate details about her. He was somehow involved in that. But he has it goes back to maybe an element within the LAPD, which is sort of this, they call it a Nazi white supremacist element within the LAPD, which I speculate that a lot of these groups, whether it's Hell's Angels or white nationalist white separatist groups, gangs, these are assets for FBI. You know, the militia groups, they get infiltrated. The FBI will try to build a case on them, and often will allow them to carry out bank robberies, all types of crimes, in order for the FBI to build a case to create the appearance of a threat to justify the budgets. And so when something like this threatens to expose this network or expose various departmental corruption, or something like the OK City bombing. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but it's suggested there again something where sort of there was an operation had been hijacked, and then all of a sudden the various bureaucracies will close ranks and cover it up, and then we'll fed the narrative of Timothy McVeigh.
Even Oswald. Whether the FBI and the CIA deliberately helped him kill Kennedy isn't even the point. There's no doubt. I mean, they even admitted to a certain extent that they did cover up a lot because they were embarrassed by this. They were supposed to keep an eye on him. So the question is just exactly how much did they cover up? So, and there's one particular person who's an FBI informant that I keep tabs on because I get a lot of information, not from him. He doesn't even know I'm watching him, but I track him across the country and I get a lot of leads that way, and he has clearly murdered some teenage girls, and it's pretty clear the FBI knows about it. Yeah.
Well, this is like what they did with Whitey Bulger, right?
Right. Yeah. Now, there's a really cool documentary telling the other side of that story that's also pretty good. But yeah, absolutely. That whole idea. Yes. It happens all the time.
Yeah, like OK City was apparently, this was exposed because some guy's brother was murdered in federal custody because he was supposedly confused with John Doe number 2, which now doesn't exist, an OK City bombing. But this is he exposed what he exposed was this operation called PatCon, which goes back to Ruby Ridge, and Oklahoma City, Patriot conspiracy, where the FBI was originally supposed to infiltrate and disrupt these groups. It turns out they were infiltrate and foment them to create these.
Oh, sure. Yeah, and there's this slippery logic, and it has to do with the Ku Klux Klan in North Carolina, where what they did was
they're all feds. No,
they went to the number 2 guy. Mm-hmm. I can't remember the name of the Grand Dragon who was really getting very popular. And we're not talking about Alabama, we're talking about North Carolina. What they did was they went to the number 2 guy and said, "Hey, you should be number 1." And what they basically did was they helped this guy take over this North Carolina Ku Klux Klan just to kind of get it away from this guy who was a little bit too popular. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it isn't just like you have a mole inside the Klan or the mafia. You start running it. I mean, well, the deal with the New York mob, the New York Italian mafia during World War II.
Yeah, Luciano,
Right, the Lucky Luciano mob, where they agreed to spy, and they were apparently good. They were loyal Americans. They were spying on, using their cousins in Europe to spy on German and Italian. It's not just that you have a double agent inside the organization. It's that they get this idea they're going to control it. Well, Castro, Noriega, a lot of Bin Laden. Mm-hmm. You know, they think, well, we run that guy, and then they end up being, you know, and I'm convinced that they're not doing it to help America. They deliberately create enemies for America to do the things that they do. I don't think the CIA works for America. I think they work for their own employers.
Well, they work for who created him, which was Wall Street in the city of London.
Yeah, right. Well, and in particular,
yeah.
You know, that goes all the way back to a very small group of families in New Haven, Connecticut, at the very dawn of the American Industrial Revolution. Mm-hmm. The guys, the people who founded Yale University and then founded Skull and Bones. Mm-hmm. Which, by the way, the original, it's not Skull with a K. It was Skull and Bones, Skull with a C, like you're sculling when they're doing the boat races.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it was not Skull with a K. It was Skull with a C. And that matters down the road, who some of these people were and who they turned out to be and who they did. And it's like listening to those FDR tapes. You know, he was the first one to start tape recording. And he's talking about doing things like cooking up these phony sex scandals to discredit Wendell Willkie. And then when he's explaining to the guy how to do it, he explains, this is what we did to Harding. You know, that he just knows, you know, he's been in it his whole life.
Yeah.
This is part of politics.
And the whole Roosevelt family, the false Republican Democrat split and all that stuff.
Right. And he talks about working for Van Leer Black and getting Black to fire this other guy who turns out to be in Skull and Bones and doing all these dirty deals for all these years. So, and that's like the people who, long before the Spanish-American War, they were financing these covert operations, these black bag jobs in places like the Philippines and Hawaii to overthrow the Spanish Empire so American corporate interests could come in and take over.
Oh yeah, they went in. The Marines were hired to go into Hawaii and take that for the sugar interests because they wanted to be. I guess they wanted to get around the tariff on sugar. Then of course there's National City Bank's interest in Cuba, which was Rockefeller, and controlling the sugar interests. And then
yeah. Well, and people don't realize this goes all the way back to the 1850s, 1860s. They've been doing this. Mm-hmm. Andrew Jackson led one of the very first. He was a secret agent who went into Florida when that was a Spanish colony and started all these covert operations. And then there were veterans of that who trained the guys to go to Texas, people like Sam Houston and Jim Bowie, to go to Texas to do the same thing, these agents provocateurs, and doing the same thing to overthrow the Spain. You know, America couldn't invade Florida without starting a war with Spain, but if you send these secret agents, these covert agents. So they've been doing it long before there was ever an OSS, let alone CIA. They've been doing this for a very long time.
Yeah, I think Manifest Destiny was August Belmont, who had was the I think a illegitimate son of a Rothschild, who married the daughter, I think, of Commodore Perry, who showed up in Japan in 1854 with his gunboats. So,
well, Americans don't know the Marines invaded Korea in 1871, I think, on one of these corporate, protecting corporate interests. We invaded Korea a long time ago. Absolutely. So, yeah, you better believe it. And yes, these people, they start banks and they finance this, and the next thing you know, they own a movie studio, and and their nephew works there, and yeah, it's all coming out. A lot of Napa County, and again, this is how Snook, these judges and these social service people and these counselors and therapists are all a bunch of them have been arrested in the last year or two. And while these people are being arrested, there's no doubt some of those fires were set. And for example, there were marijuana farms that burnt up, so you know what's going on there. But there's also certain places where some of these crimes may have happened, and those are torched in these fires. And then recently, while they were fighting one of these fires, they're digging these fire breaks, and they find some more graves where some victims have been buried. that had not been known about previously. So, and these are people who are involved in Child Protective Services are being busted for child trafficking. And this is in Napa County, but it's a much more widespread problem. And these people are connected to Pelosi and some of these other people.
But it's not being reported anywhere.
Two limo drivers have been killed in either sketchy accidents or unsolved murders in the last few months. Limo drivers who work for these people. Who else has been killed recently? Like I said, the children of these guys who worked for Lockheed Martin in their cybersecurity and computer science departments. Yeah, all of us, and of course, all these are, it was a suicide, or we don't, no foul play suspected. But a lot of these people are being arrested. I mean, and Corey Feldman had said that he had told Santa Barbara police all about these Hollywood people who had been abusing him and his friends. And Santa Barbara police for, what's it been, 25 years? What tape? And a couple weeks ago, here it is. Progress is being made. And the more that we and our listeners, the more we get this out there, the more pressure these people are under, or the more confidence they have that there'll be something in it if they'll go after these people. And it is happening. So progress is being made. I don't want to sound too pessimistic and too cynical when I talk about these things, because there are millions of people out there who do care and they do want justice, and we're starting to have an effect. So chin up. We're making progress here.
Now, with the whole serial killer phenomenon, we get this archetype. What exactly is being done there from a cultural programming standpoint? Because we have familiar with the work of Dave McGowan, and he looked at the modern American phenomenon of the serial killer, and he conducted research and made these connections that because a lot of these serial killers were patsies. They were taking the rap to protect a much more well-organized network of sadistic monsters. And he makes a lot of these serial killers have connections to the military. He kind of came to the theory that part of it could have been a Phoenix program domestically applied, and the effect of it would be to sort of atomize society, and also to create a modern-day version of Murder Incorporated. You could carry out some selected hits and then haystack it in between a bunch of other deaths, and you create this sensational story of a serial killer. Have you given any thought to that theory?
Well, speaking of which, I almost forgot to mention, based on a tip, we've developed a very interesting suspect in this Golden State Killer case. Mm-hmm. And this suspect, we're having a hard. He's very mysterious, but he has a brother who, once again, hooked up with certain people, that I think begins to lend some credence to this. That there's this odd book that was published by L. Ron Hubbard back in the early 70s. He actually, in this book, he tends to imply that Sherry Jo Bates was murdered by and Hubbard would complain a lot about the Grimstons and their process church, saying, and he would go into great detail, saying this is how they recruit people, this is how they screen people, and then this is how they use people. That they would have people, and like Manson's a good example. He didn't necessarily know that Polanski and LaBianca were involved in some major cocaine deal and were about to be wiped out. He thought, they kill these people. That'll be good for your movement. Like they get pointed at certain people. Mm-hmm. Then if they get caught, they didn't know why they were killing this person. No. So they can't spill the beans because they had their own crazy motive. But you recruit, you screen, you train, you use these people. So I think there's a lot to that in a lot of these cases. Now, another good example that may fit this pattern. I should let you talk for a minute.
Oh,
Maybe
so
it'll
for
ring
Sherry,
that bell again.
Sherry Jo Bates was the young lady. She was stabbed to death, nearly decapitated on Halloween Eve, 1966, in Riverside, California, City College. And it was Paul Avery who tried to link that to the Zodiac, right?
Well, the funny thing is that's the only unsolved murder in the history of Riverside Police Department.
Uh-huh.
And Hubbard tried to pin that on the Grimstons and their mob of I know what it is. The Santeria. Now, people have forgotten all about them, but there was a gang of cross-border narcotics traffickers down in the Texas, El Paso area, again, using these occult beliefs to control members of the gang and to sort of empower and enable some of their hitmen. And so there's no... And there's another one. There's another group doing the same. Well, the Nazis used occult beliefs, for the SS and for the Gestapo. There's plenty of evidence that this very often, maybe not every serial killer, but certainly using the myth of the serial killer as not just as a red herring, but to create unease and to create the populist demands, law and order, and doing all of these things.
You have the bureaucracy at Quantico, the FBI lab, and all that, right?
Right.
A lot of money involved in that. A lot of police resources, and these things can be increased. Same thing with the connection with the Symbionese Liberation Army, Vacaville Prison, and MK Ultra, where again this creates the pretext for militarized police forces and the SWAT teams. And these things tie right back to the CIA, and these are assets that are out there to provoke
mind control drugs. I mean, there really is a memo. Really is a study from a scientist working for the CIA pointing out that sodium fluoride is one of the truth serum drugs, and saying, well, it would be good for people's teeth, and also, by the way, it might make them a little bit more suggestible. I mean, there is a scientific theory behind that.
MK Ultra was all about that mass mind control, mass dosing, and manipulation. You can even look at today's psychiatric general practice is whether it's the colleges. I heard in an article 25% of all the students in college are receiving psychiatric care and are on drugs. And that's the mass dose. The question is today's psychiatry applied to MK Ultra? Is there a distinction anymore? I mean,
and would they even know? Well, there's that famous interview with Aldous Huxley, who had written the novel Brave New World, and him saying, the age of terror, state terror, is over. Now it's all about entertainment and tranquilizers, and that's how they control people. Yep. And I think he was absolutely right.
Well, I mean, look at the dosing rate now and all that. Yeah,
right. Well, and you have certain pharmaceutical companies, Park Davis. You have RKO. RKO was very much involved in government grants, making not just propaganda films, but this whole idea of subliminal advertising and right into RKO. Some people at RKO were real big into that. And the funny thing is, you keep running over the same names over and over and over. It's not a random network of people. It's, this person and this person. Well, they got their finger in another pie. I do think to a certain extent, some media outlets, there is pressure to do that. That movie, M, The Murderer Among Us, is partly a critique of the Nazis doing that, making a big deal out of serial killers in order to get people behind the idea of a police state to put a stop to these horrible crimes. Oh, yeah. And some notorious murderers, it turns out they were hitmen for either the CIA or OSS or something.
Well, we have the example
they just trying to turn them loose.
Yeah, we have the example of Operation Mongoose and the use Alan Dulles, working with Johnny Roselli and who's the other guy, Santo Trafficante, who might have been a triple agent,
Right.
And the use of so-called mechanics in some of these operations and these things and. These are Murder Incorporated, and you could even look at the broader picture of the mob itself, where they were allowed to grow and develop, and they became assets of intelligence. You mentioned Luciano Project during World War II, and then in return for that, they are allowed to control the heroin trade in the post-war era. And this also, I think, explains a lot of the Vietnam War, because prior to 1964, the CIA was OSS, and then CIA were in there, and they were kind of nudging the French out to dominate the opium trade.
Well, actually, but the thing is, it's not that they said, "Will you spy for us?" And they said, "Yeah, but we want a concession to him." They had the reason they contacted Luciano's mob was because they'd already been dealing with him for a very long time.
Yeah.
Right, the pharmaceutical companies, you can't grow opium poppies in America. Mm-hmm. The only sources of either raw opium or even processed heroin were either Turkey or the Golden Triangle, and then you have American pharmaceutical companies. See, a lot of that was controlled either by the French or British. So you have to smuggle it out of their empires, even for a quote unquote legitimate pharmaceutical purpose. Mm-hmm. For example, during World War II, they needed, we had a terrible shortage of morphine to treat our wounded soldiers and sailors and Marines. So you had Chenot and Cooper flying their old established routes. They already know, they got the planes, they got the airfields. They're flying into Burma, which is part of the British Empire, and they're flying out heroin and morphine, and this is used to treat wounded, because the Japanese had cut this off. They went to those people because they'd already been in that business for a long time.
Yeah, and of course that's how Chiang Kai-shek financed his nationalist forces.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Khan Shah and Vang Pao, and of course, and the narcos in South America, and
of course the 80s,
of course that's the people who do it.
And the opium's refined in the Pepsi-Cola plant. So there's your right, because they're right, and the perfect example that I was thinking of was it's not that the CIA, in order to do their job, has to cozy up to drug traffickers. It's that's how they got started in the first place. Skull and Bones, the Clipper ships.
They already had this network of smugglers and spies that they tapped into when they decided to make this government agency called the CIA.
Yeah, because it goes with the financial colossal companies which created the CIA, but they originally got their funding through the opium trade. So,
right. They brought them into the government agency. They didn't have these clean-cut government agents going out and becoming drug dealers. They recruited drug dealers to be CIA agents. Mm-hmm. That's the whole thing. Because and people like Roman Polanski, you have connections. It's all one black market. It's all one underground railroad. You don't have 5 or 6 different. And if you're going to have smuggling people in and out, you have to deal with human traffickers who are trafficking. Doing all kinds of slaves are being trafficked in and out, and then you just put your spy on that same railroad. You don't build one from scratch.
Yeah, and of course, in Hollywood, a lot of these production companies are great. Movies themselves are great ways to launder drug money. Same as the banks and maybe even a hair salon. Because you've
right.
JC being international, these things and. So these things all become very convenient. This is how everyone's kind of roped in, and they're all intermingled in this.
Well, even Harriet Tubman's Underground Railroad, some branches of that were pre-existing smugglers networks that they just made deals with. You're just paying bribes. Can we get our people on this too?
Yeah.
They didn't start that from scratch. Mm-hmm. There's a really good series on AME or some AMC that show about Washington spies. Which, it's fictionalized, but it's pretty good. You have people like Ethan Allen, who's a terrorist, but now you make him into a revolutionary hero. You get him to work for you.
I thought he made furniture.
Oh no, they were terrorists and smugglers.
Yeah,
and they just said, well, come work for us. Mm-hmm. And same thing with a lot of the smugglers and privateers. It's all, you're doing business. Once again, you're dealing with the devil because they're the ones who they're already in place doing this. One of the interesting things about the American Revolution is how many senior British government officials, these lords, they were selling weapons and other ammunition and other supplies to the American rebels. I mean, to get that were used to kill British soldiers that these same people were sending to America. They were working both sides. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and at the high finance level, we won our independence, but I think the Treaty of Paris made sure that we made good on the debts, which is why we got the first national bank and the second national.
Oh, sure, yeah, because you got to keep the balance of payments. This was something that got disrupted during World War I that triggered a global depression.
Yeah,
it interfered with the balance of payment system. So during World War II, they quietly kept the balance of payments going. And one good example of this, before he was kicked out of Germany, chased out of Germany by the Nazis, Einstein held several key patents, licensed to the Siemens Corporation, and Einstein co-invented the electromagnetic gyro compass for submarines. He was receiving his royalty payment checks on schedule all the way through World War II. Siemens was building these U-boats, and they were paying Einstein his royalties on that invention, and it went through the normal channels of the international balance of payments, even though there was a world war going on.
Yeah, and I think the Warburgs were a large portion owner of IG Farben. So.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Well, Ford. Oh, don't get me started.
I know. We talked about it last time.
And Ford.
And I think Alexander Hamilton and George Washington both were Freemasons, and so was King George. So.
Yeah, it's all right. George Carlin said it's all one big club, and you ain't in it.
One big happy lodge.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but yeah, we unraveled the psychological warfare aspect of the serial killer, how it would affect the America and what effect it had America in the 70s and 80s is interesting. Because if you look at, one thing, the theory that sort of it kind of kicks off in the 70s, and that's when the Vietnam War is winding down. And of course, William Colby, who spearheaded Phoenix Operation in Vietnam, comes home, and that's when you start to have the serial killer phenomenon, at least reported. The question, to what extent do these serial killers are as prolific as they say? You're reporting on how the press covers these things. We really can't be certain that these serial killers are as prolific or as deadly as we read about. Are these just stories to scare us? We have to ask that question. Or are these figures that they're put out there to kill a few people, haystack a few deaths, where the black op guys kill a guy, then they let this guy go and kill a string of people, and they pin it all on the serial killer, like someone like Dennis Rader or something like that.
Henry Lee Lucas.
Henry Lee Lucas, the only one who was.
Yeah.
Now his story is interesting because he was this prolific serial killer who was teamed up with Otis Toole, by the way, another serial killer.
Right.
Who got off easy in Florida, where Jeb Bush is governor. But anyway. George Bush, right, is the only one that he commutes Henry Lee Lucas's sentence from death, even despite the fact he's a convicted serial killer, boasting of killing hundreds. But what does Henry Lee Lucas claim that's so astonishing? Are you familiar with that story?
Not off the top of my head.
Henry Lee Lucas claims that he was a hitman. And what's funny that he claims there's these ranches just over the border of Mexico, which were subsequently exposed. These satanic ranches of human trafficking and these things.
That's right. And then other people get curious about that. Are other mob hitmen also serial killers?
Yeah.
Right. That is interesting. Because he was somebody who was a lot smarter than he looked. He looked like an idiot, but he was not.
But you have George W. Bush, this hanging governor, commutes his sentence.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The only one he did, by the way. The only one he did was Henry Lee Lucas. It's strange. Again, what's the function of this? A certain branch of Murder Incorporated. That's you can take out a few interesting. It's the same principle trying blowing up a plane with 100 people on it to get one person. They do that. I'm sorry, they do that. Suggesting that's what the Pan Am bombing was, but I don't want to get into that rabbit hole.
Martha Mitchell. She was on a plane that was blown up.
With Howard Hunt's wife, right?
Oh yeah.
Or is that a separate plane? I think it's a separate plane.
Well, that was she was shooting her mouth off about what she knew about Watergate, and and the terrible irony there is Nixon had nothing to do with that burglary, but you have a situation where these guys get caught and they start blackmailing the president of the United States.
Yeah, and of course, another literary creation is Deep Throat, right? Even Ben Bradley said, "I don't even think he ever really existed."
Yeah, right. There's a pretty compelling case that Alexander Haig was Deep Throat.
Yeah.
And this guy that they put up as Deep Throat, I'm sure he passed along some information, but he's not. He couldn't account. Yeah, that's all. Well, and the truth about
Watergate in general.
Not Bernstein, the other guy.
Woodward, who was naval intelligence, right?
Oh yeah, right. He lied about his background too. That turns out to be very interesting. And a lot of the books he writes are, revisionist history or covering up for people or.
Well, we're getting late into the interview. What is the takeaway? You're talking about this literary creation. These figures don't exist. It is a product of our imagination and our manipulated, or basically, getting this. This raises a very important cognitive and epistemological question about not what do we know what's going on in the world when the authorities, the received or accepted institutions of public information, the media, are so corrupt and they can't be relied upon. They're actually creating an entire false narrative. What about our history about these things, about these figures in history, about these events, and what's the takeaway?
Well, I think that it's now it's the democratization of information, the internet, the alternative media, what we're doing right now, and it's really working, and it's really having an effect. More than ever, more truth is coming out than ever before, and it's certainly not coming out from what some people call mainstream media, the corporate media. It is coming out from us and our listeners and people who put in the time and form these teams. And we've got people who filter through those Clinton emails. I don't have time to do. We have people who do that. They put in their time, and we can communicate with each other now, and we can get the truth out. The truth's coming out more and more and more. It is working, and people's eyes are being opened. I mean, it is the red pill moment where people are beginning to realize what's actually happening and sharing that information. So I'm actually pretty hopeful. I'm actually pretty hopeful that it's going to be more and more difficult for these people to keep this a secret. The secrets are coming out.
Yeah, and I just think you have to be careful when you're dealing with revision in these things. Don't get too stuck on a certain brand or figure or character, because there's a lot of brand loyalty here. There's a cult of personality. The Zodiac never existed, yet there's a cult of personality around the Zodiac.
You know how many people? He's their hero.
Yeah.
There's so many people who get so upset when I show them that he didn't exist. It's like when Rush Limbaugh, he used to have a TV show for a while, and he showed that clip of Bill Clinton pretending to cry at that funeral, and people weren't mad. They weren't mad at Bill Clinton. They were mad at Rush Limbaugh for showing the tape.
Yeah.
Because you damaged their hero. A lot of people, the Zodiac Killer is their hero, and they get really offended when there was no Zodiac Killer, and they just get so mad. But that's, you're going to have that. But I think the average listener is more interested in the truth and skepticism, and that's a skill, and they're learning, and I see a lot of progress being made, and really grateful to the listeners for listening. It wouldn't be any point to us doing this if people weren't listening. So and hopefully they get encouraged to dig and do this. And one more time, there's no such thing as getting too many tips. So if you think you have information, or if you have questions, the Stones Unturned podcast, we're going to start having listeners actually come on the show with their questions. We'll give them 5, 10, 15 minutes and ask them follow-up questions instead of just emailing them to us. So I think that'll be a fun feature of the show. But to get the audience, not just make the audience feel involved, but they are involved, and to encourage them to be even more involved with what we're doing. So,
okay, great. So that's Thomas Henry Horan. Get his books on the Zodiac. The one we talked about tonight was The Myth of the Zodiac Killer. His other ones are The Great Zodiac Killer Hoax of 1969 and the Great Zodiac Killer Hoax of 1986. They all cover different aspects of this story, so they're not just redundant. They're all very important works. And And they all, of course, obviously they complement each other. And, of course, your podcast, the Stones Unturned Podcast. So,
thanks, Tim. Really appreciate you having me on.
Thank you for coming on, and I wish you good night.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.